Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. Today in Dave's Garage, we're going to take a look back at the PC I just built. You can hear it kind of roaring away over my shoulder, perhaps. And we're going to go back and see what I would do different if I had the chance to do it again. And thanks to Amazon.com's liberal exchange and return policies, I had that opportunity. And I took advantage of it in a few cases. I'll let you know where and what I changed coming right up. So this PC is built around the 3970 Threadripper from AMD. I bought that chip largely based on its specs and on benchmarks. And the question now is, I could have gone with a 3990 with twice the number of cores at twice the price. So do I regret my choice of the 3970? No. It's an awesome chip, actually. In fact, it's more CPU than I thought I was getting. I was expecting that the instructions per cycle had not really changed much since the i7 days, and I actually don't know to what extent that accounts for it, but on a serial workload, on a single core score, 4 gigahertz or 4.3 gigahertz that I'm getting out of the 3970 seems a lot faster than the 4 gigahertz I could get out of my old i7. You'd think it might be like 9% difference, but it seems like a lot more than that. And in fact, in benchmark, in Geek Score, it goes from like 850 to 1320. So that's a pretty significant change, and that's just on the single core. On the multi-core, it goes from something like 4,000 to 29,000, almost 30,000. So quite a difference there. So in terms of clock speeds, I'm seeing a consistent 4.3 gigahertz when it is just a couple of cores running. When it's all cores, I'm getting a solid 4.0. Actually like 3.98, and I wish it was 4.0, but it bounces a little bit over 4 and it comes back down below to like 3.98, and then bounces back up, and you'll see a little sawtooth pattern every now and then as it tries a higher clock speed. As I said, the chip is plenty fast when it comes to a sequential workload, 1350 or so, being a pretty decent score in Geekbench 5. But it's on the parallel workloads where it really shines. If you can think of it in terms of an old 4-core chip coming along, let's say there are 32 work items to be performed. The 4-core comes along and it says, give me 4, you hang on to the other 28, I'll be back, I'll do these 4, and it hands it back. Okay, give me the next 4, you keep the other 24, I'll do these 4, and I'll come back. Comes back, takes another 4, and so on. Whereas the 3970 says, give me all the work now, I complete, I return, we are done. I don't know actually what accent the 3970 would have. Eastern Soviet Bloc, 1980s bad guy? Maybe. Anyway, do you remember that Simpsons episode where Homer visits basically Dante's Inferno and his punishment is to eat all the donuts? That's how this chip goes through parallel workloads. Kind of like that. One thing I should explain and probably apologize for is going to be the constantly color shifting hue in the background and foreground. There's a lot of RGB stuff going on, and I'm actually debugging a Docker container that's about a second off. Anyway, you may never notice, but if the color changing in the background kind of annoys you, I apologize. It's not something that's going to happen all the time. Did some benchmarking, wrote them down in my little book, because I could make fancy PowerPoint slides, but you just want to know the numbers, and I'll put those on the screen. The quickest, dirtiest, and easiest benchmark I find to run is Geekbench if you have time. And if you're pressed for time, CPU-Z gives me a really good, concise, quick benchmark, and it gives you both multi-core and single-core score. So for multi-core, I was getting 16,511 and 443 straight out of the box. That was not that impressive because I was seeing numbers like 17 and 18,000 from other people online. So all I did was went in and enabled the XMP memory profile, which brought my RAM up to 3600 megahertz, and I didn't go in and mess with the F-clock, so I haven't done that yet either. So I'm not an overclocking dude. The chip's going to run at total normal stock parameters, except for this XMP memory profile. And that brought it up to 21,514, so that was a significant jump. I did play around with the overclocking tools, remove the 280 watt cap, things like that. Precision Boost Overdrive got it to 21,445, 512. So about the same for a single core, but a little better for multi-core, and I guess that's because it's able to take more power. For the heck of it, I just cranked the old B clock up to 125. And I got 21,713 and 521. Finally, even though I don't know what I'm doing, I bumped the voltage up to 1.375 only, which doesn't seem very aggressive to me. I don't know that much about it. But I bumped the speed up to 4,300 on all cores, and that cranked out a 23,520, 542. I then tried 4,500 megahertz, and it crashed. So then I put everything back to total stock, loaded BIOS defaults, it loaded the XMP memory profile, and that's how I'm going to run it. The next big change is, what the heck, man? I thought it was going in a rack. I thought it was going into a rack mount machine. That's not a rack mount case. That's like some Lian Li fancy thing. And yeah, I'm going to say Lian Li all day because I don't know how to pronounce Lian Li or General Li or any of those other southern terms. So I'll be just calling it the Lian Li. So why would it be Lian? I don't know. I have no idea. But that's how I'm going to say it. I start a fad. I'm going to rename the company. So as you can see, this machine is running 9 fans in there, not counting the power supply. So 10 fans total, I guess. Plus the CPU fans, but 10 internal and exhaust fans. Count the power supply, they're split evenly. 5 intake, 5 exhaust. If you just look at the case fans, then it's 5 intake and 4 exhaust. Figure gravity and heat transfer helps a little bit on its own. That seemed like a wise balance. The way I have it wired now, I can run it in motherboard mode, where it will just emulate whatever's going on with the current Gigabyte platform, which I've got set to just color cycle, as you can see now. If you want to be fancier, you can do rainbow mode, because these are individually addressable. So instead of changing the entire fan all at once, it can control each and every LED. As you may know, I'm a bit of a connoisseur when it comes to individually addressable LEDs, so the frame rate could be higher, but otherwise, it's kind of interesting. They treat all the fans the same, and I believe they're running them all in parallel. So individually addressable, but each fan is a copy of all the other fans, as far as I can tell. That's only important if you were doing something where the physical position of the fans was important. Say you wanted a flame effect to travel from the bottom up to the top. Well, that's only going to work if you can control each fan and the LEDs in it individually. This doesn't give you any kind of control like that. So, gonna switch this back to motherboard, but I really don't want a color cycling, so I'm gonna go DIY, motherboard off, pow. Back to basic spinning blue. That's about as sedate as this one gets. Well, other than you could do solid color, and you could do white. Yeah, you could do just solid white. You could actually, wait, can I do that? There you go. Turn them off. But I like them. The fans are interesting enough that I'm kind of thinking I should do an episode just on them alone. Let me know if you are interested in more information on these fans. So that explains how the fancy blinking lights are done, but why is it not in a rack mount case? And the reason is this crazy AORUS Extreme motherboard. It is so long from the I/O plate down to the very bottom of the motherboard that it does not fit in any cases I could find that would fit in a rack. The first thing I ordered was a very nice Silverstone 4U case, and it arrived, and I was happy with it because it looked pretty and it had 5 slots, hot swap slots for hard drives, and I stuck the motherboard in there. It's like, that doesn't fit. Now, in reality, once I looked at that, if you have the 19 inches, this board plus a conventional power supply is more than a rack mount. So there's no way it can fit. But here in my arsenal, I had an SC846, which is the giant Supermicro case with 24 bays and dual power supplies and everything else, but they're long, skinny power supplies, so there's actually a whole bunch of room. There's certainly enough room for this board. So I thought, what the heck? I'll put it in that, then I'll change the fans out to some Noctua 120s instead of the really fast 80s that are in there now, make it quiet so I can live in the house with it. Well, still doesn't fit. Still too big. And the reason, again, is just the distance from the I/O plate down to the bottom. So I could recut the I/O plate hole, perhaps, and move it an inch north in the case so that there's more room on the bottom side. But then I'm also contending with, how do I get all my PCI connectors off of these power supplies, which are really server-based. So they don't have any PCI outputs, or maybe they have 1 or 2. But they certainly don't have the multiples that I need. I decided I'd put it in a tower case. I looked around at cases, and when you look at the internal dimensions of cases, the number of cases that will accommodate this motherboard, which is listed as ATX XL, is very few. So the Lian Li XL was one that I decided looked decent enough in pictures, had the decent specs. It was a little pricey. I think it's close to $200, like $199 perhaps. But I needed something that would actually fit the thing. And I ordered these crazy fans as well, which I'll put affiliate links to Amazon down in the description in case you're looking for those. They're like under $30 for a set of 3 plus a controller, so good deal, I thought. And almost 5-star reviews, and not just from like the guy in Shenzhen who listed them and his 20 uncles. It seems that people that are actually buying them are happy with them because it has like 2,300 reviews. So that explains why it's in the case. I have two GPUs in there. As you may remember, I was putting 5700 XT in there. I also had a 1070 Ti kicking around from my old machine, which it was an upgrade, mid-cycle. It's not the card that I built it with 7 years ago, but it's a card I put in there a couple years ago. I think I did some mining in the early days of Bitcoin. Actually, yeah, I did make a little money off that, even if you count the video card, but not very much, like hundreds of dollars. Hundreds, I tell you. So I put both GPUs in there. But my plan was to pass at least one of them through to Hyper-V VMs, so that the host could have a video card and the VM could have a dedicated video card. Unfortunately, I have not figured out how to do that successfully on the AMD platform yet, but such is life. So when you've got two GPUs in there, it's very important to get good airflow to them. And because I want to have potentially 4 PCI cards in here, I have two GPUs, I have the RAID NVMe card, which I don't have in currently, and I have a Thunderbolt 3 Titan Ridge card. More on that later, if I remember. I wrote it down. I'll remember now. So the physical arrangement of the GPUs is important to ensure good airflow. If I were to run all 4 cards, I would need some angle adapters to move some connectors at the very bottom of the board for the LED lighting, because they come straight up and would collide with the video card if I put a video card in the very bottom slot. So that's not an impossible fix. But to do it, I would need to then move that card all the way down, and that would free up the use of all other 3 slots. So I'm trying to keep the GPUs away from one another so they don't bake one another. So what I've got is the GTX card and then the AMD card below that. But in between them, I have the Titan Ridge card, which is a short kind of stubby card and basically opens up access to the fan so that the GTX card can breathe. I don't know if it's quite ideal, but there's been no problem so far. The only other argument I could make is if I had the longer card, the AMD card on top, so that airflow from the bottom 3 fans hit both cards a little more equally. But again, I don't have a problem I'm trying to solve. I just think that might be a little more optimal. Right now, it's kind of a burn-in test to make sure everything's working happily. I'm running folding at home, and I'm targeting both GPUs and the CPU. So I have slots for all 3, and it's producing a fair bit of heat. I'm going to go check what the power consumption is right now, actually. 830. Now, you're saying, Dave, you had a 750 watt power supply. How are you doing that? So clearly I hadn't future-proofed myself, because adding the second GPU pushed the power consumption, even with the 750 watt power supply, up to 815. And I figure if they're 80% efficient, that was something 600 and some watts, it's probably not a good idea to run them right at their capacity full time. It's a lot of heat, I imagine, as well. So I decided, discretion being the better part of valor, I should upgrade to a bigger power supply. There's not a lot of power supplies available right now, but I found the Seasonic unit seemed to be really high quality and had good reviews, so I grabbed the 1200 watt Seasonic from Vantex. It's kind of a work of art, really, and I'm pretty happy with it. So it was not brutally expensive either. I mean, it wasn't cheap for a power supply, but it's a nice unit. So right now, pulling, what did I say, 830 of the possible 12, well, I bet it can pull 1500 at the wall to produce about 1200 DC. Pretty amazing. These things will produce 100 amps at 12 volts. You could weld pretty easily with 100 amps at 12 volts. So that's some beefy power supply. There's a video, welding with your Fantech power supply. If you remember, I mentioned that one of the benefits of running a too big power supply is that it probably runs quieter when it's under less load. And in fact, I believe this power supply has a hybrid button on the back that when you activate hybrid mode, this thing can run up to half load, or is it 600? Somewhere 400, 600 watts, somewhere in that range, where you're at the normal workload and with no fan, which would be really nice if you were building a case to be very quiet. Now, in this case, these fans are not under CPU control. They're just on all the time, and you control what speed you want, and you just leave them at that, unfortunately, because the controller has no integration with any of the motherboard sensors. So one thing I found interesting is that this board has an undocumented, basically, Thunderbolt 3 connection and ability. It has in the motherboard manual a THC_B as one of the connectors. Or is it TBC? I don't know, THC, TBC, what's the difference? Long story short, it has a Thunderbolt 3 connector right on the motherboard that goes, ostensibly, to one of their daughter cards, which then provides Thunderbolt 3 ports out the back. So what I did is I bought that card, even though it's made for a different one of their motherboards, Titan Ridge. I installed the card, hooked everything up, hooked up the PCI power, hooked up the little internal cables that go to the motherboard, and plugged it into a PCI slot. Sure enough, with the drivers installed, because Gigabyte has drivers for it, I plugged in my Thunderbolt 3 SSD from my Mac, and there it was. It wasn't all that fast. The read speeds were kind of marginal, but then again, it's not a super fast SSD that I have in that particular one. Read speeds were maybe 1300 and write speeds were like 500 megas a second, so I mean, still way better than SATA. But I also connected my MacBook to this PC through the Thunderbolt 3. Both acknowledge that the machine is connected on the other side. On the Mac, I can see that on the end of the Thunderbolt, I can see the machine called Minerva. And from Minerva, the PC, I can see the MacBook. But clicking on the icons on either side does 0. I was hoping maybe, hey, it's going to share files or some magical USB protocol, but no. If you plug two Macs together, they can network and you get like a 40 gigabit connection between two Macs. So it would be nice to get that between two PCs or between a PC and a MacBook, but I was not able to make actual use of the connection between different platforms. But it does work for peripherals, so I know that much. I do have a Thunderbolt 3 dual RAID card that I could plug into it. Unfortunately, it's formatted for Mac, but I can see if it shows up. So if that's something you're desperately curious about, let me know in the comments. I can give that a whirl as well. Also, in terms of the case, to revisit that topic, I found that this case will almost fit my office. I have a cubby in the front of my desk, and it allows for something like 21 inches, and this Lian case is about an inch too tall. But even if it were only just, an inch or so shorter, there's not enough room on the top, so you really need an inch for discharge, probably more than an inch for fan discharge. So there's no way it'll fit on my desk, which means it goes in the server closet, which is why I wasn't worried about the fan noise. But now that I've seen the quality of the experience that this machine can provide raw HDMI sitting there at a 4K monitor to play a game like Flight Simulator, I kind of want to have it in my office rather than off in the server room because I want the first-person experience. The terminal server client works great for 90% of the cases. And in most cases, I'm actually terminal servered into a virtual machine inside of this server, not to the actual server itself. But when it comes to gaming and things like that, that's on the bare metal. Unless and until I can figure out a way to pass through a GPU to one of the Hyper-Vs and do it efficiently and get good performance, I'm otherwise stuck with running the games and so on at the bare metal level. That in turn means I want an HDMI connection to my desktop. I have a little box, I believe called USB Anywhere, where you run a piece of software on the PC and it remotes some USB ports across the LAN. Works really well. The only thing is, that only gets you the USB ports and I want video. So I'm either going to look into pulling fiber and running Thunderbolt 3 if I can get the video working over Thunderbolt 3, which was another thing I didn't mention. I got everything working except I can't get my video to pass through and come out the Thunderbolt 3 port. That's a little frustrating. The way this Titan Ridge card works is it has two Thunderbolt 3 outputs and it has a DisplayPort output. It then has two mini DisplayPort inputs, and so you connect those via adapter cables to your video card. You push your two DisplayPort sources out into the video card and it pushes them back out to Thunderbolt 3. So if you had a fancy monitor that had a Thunderbolt 3 connection, you could just plug it into that and you would get your mouse and keyboard and everything else and power and video signal all in LAN, everything happening over one connection. That's how I use my MacBook in my office. However, I haven't got the video portion working. And because it's technically not supported and not intended for this motherboard, I can't complain too loudly. Because if I can get it working, then I can try remoting the Thunderbolt 3 port across fiber as a way to remote the machine away from my desk and keep it in the office, or keep it in the server room, and I can sit in my office, which is a little more than 100 feet away, so it's too far for an HDMI run of any kind that I know of. Once I found out that I was within about an inch or two of this case fitting in my desk, I realized I'm running the XL. I wonder if the non-XL would fit, and sure enough it does. So then, even though it doesn't say it's made for bigger motherboards, I think it just calls it an ATX case, I counted the number of slots shown in the picture, and it's got 8 slots. Now, this board is only a 7-slot layout, but it's really only 4 slots because every alternate one is missing. But they're laid out on the same span as 7 old ISA slots in an IBM PC. So, 7 slots. But it has an extra 3/4 of an inch of board hanging off the bottom that would occupy where the 8th slot would go. So if the case has room for 8 slots, it might accommodate this board. So I ordered the non-XL version of this case, which lacks some of the LED strip lighting and some other niceties, but is otherwise the tinier version, It's a more regular, less enormous version of this case. If the motherboard fits, I'm going to transfer everything from this case into the smaller case and stick this baby in my office so I can use it for things like Flight Simulator, gaming, Steam, whatever. I'm not a big gamer, but I mean, I like watching the 3D demos at a high frame rate. Finally, we should talk about the software that comes from Gigabyte called Rgb Fusion. It is what controls the LED motherboards, and since I've got all the case lighting tied into the LED controlled sources on the motherboard, most of my lighting is dependent on it when not running in one of these remote control modes. I was excited to get ready and use their software because I write LED control software as a hobby. Now, my stuff is running in the background here behind me, and it's a fair bit more complex than what's going on inside the PC, so I expected it to be, you know, solid. It's not. It's rough, man. The only way I've been able to get this software to work is to run it, have it communicate with the motherboard BIOS and tell it, you know, do color cycle or some really basic thing. Use Task Manager to kill the app before it can crash or otherwise mess up what it's doing. Thanks for joining me for today's little retrospective. If you enjoy stuff like this, please give it a thumbs up. If it annoyed you because it's not technical enough or you prefer my other stuff, give this a thumbs down just so I know. Don't be facetious and give it a thumbs down just because you want to see. If you got to do that, give it 2 thumbs down at least, that way. And even a multiple of 2, please. That way it won't hurt anything. But if you genuinely didn't like it, then please do leave it a thumbs down. But if you did, leave it a thumbs up so I know what's going on. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing because I'm just in it for the subs and likes. I'm not selling anything and I don't have any Patreon. So perhaps if I had Patreon, I could pay for my Lian Lee. Yes. Thanks, good night, and I'll see you next time.
Subscribe.